She was 22 and had nowhere left to go. In the last week of October, with the first hard frost already silvering the fields and ice beginning to form at the edges of the creek, Nessa Holt was handed $40 and told that the house she had lived in since childhood was no longer hers to sleep in. Settle in, and let us know where you're watching from tonight as we tell her story. Nessa's whole life had been shaped by a woman most people in the county had underestimated. Her grandmother, Bertie Holt, had run a small blacksmith shop at the edge of Harrow's Landing, a mill town in the Ottawa Valley, for nearly 30 years. Bertie had learned the trade from her own father, who had learned it from his, and she wore that inheritance the way other women wore Sunday dresses, with quiet pride and without apology. She had large, capable hands and a voice like gravel in a tin pail, and she had no patience for people who confused loudness with authority. She was the one who had raised Nessa after Nessa's mother died of fever when Nessa was barely 4 years old. Bertie had taught Nessa everything she knew. How to read the color of heating iron. The dull red that meant the metal was warming. The bright cherry that meant it was ready. The near white that meant you had pushed it past the point of no return. How to listen to the hammer's ring for the note that told you the work was going well. How to judge the temper of a tool not by what it looked like, but by how it held its edge. She taught Nessa that a piece of iron was not a fixed thing. It was a conversation between heat, force, and patience. You could not bully good ironwork into existence. You had to coax it. Every morning from the time Nessa was 7 years old, the two of them had walked together through the back door of the shop, and every evening they had banked the coals together and swept the floor clean before they went inside for supper. The shop smelled of coal smoke and scorched scale, and the particular sharp mineral scent of quenched metal. To Nessa, it was the smell of home. Bertie had one tool she prized above all others, a cross-peen hammer with a handle she had replaced 3 times over the years, each time fitting it herself from a piece of white ash she had chosen and shaped carefully in the shop. The head was old, marked with decades of use, but it was perfectly balanced, and Bertie's hand had worn a groove into the ash handle that had shaped itself to her grip over 30 years of mornings. She called it by no name. It was simply the hammer, and everyone who worked around her knew what she meant. When Bertie died in the spring, a sudden, silent thing, her heart giving out one night while she slept, as if it had simply finished its work and set itself down. Nessa had sat at the kitchen table for 3 days before she could bring herself to go into the shop. She was 22. She had no one else in the world. But she had the shop, and she had her grandmother's tools, and she told herself that was enough to begin. She was wrong about that, as it turned out. Or rather, she was right about what she had, and wrong about who else felt entitled to it. Bertie's son, Nessa's uncle, was a man named Garrett Holt, who had left Harrow's Landing 15 years earlier to go into land speculation in the townships west of Ottawa. He had come back twice in all that time, once to borrow money, and once to attend his own mother's funeral, and both times he had stayed less than a week. Nessa had never known him well, and what she knew she did not particularly like. He had their grandmother's size but none of her steadiness. He held himself the way men do when they have spent years trying to convince other people, and themselves, that they are more important than they actually are. He arrived in Harrow's Landing 4 days after the funeral, with a city lawyer in tow, and a set of documents that he laid out on Bertie's kitchen table with the careful deliberateness of a man who had been rehearsing the moment. The shop, the property, the house, all of it had been left, he explained, without a proper will. Bertie had never formalized her intentions in writing, because Bertie had believed, as many people of her generation did, that family understood what family was owed. She had told Nessa more than once that the shop would be hers, but a conversation in a kitchen at the end of a working day was not a legal document, and Garrett Holt had found a solicitor willing to attest to that fact. Nessa stood in the room where she had eaten every meal of her life and listened to the man explain why none of it belonged to her. He did not raise his voice. He did not look directly at her for more than a few seconds at a time. His lawyer spoke mostly in a low, even tone that had the quality of water running steadily over a drain. Technically neutral, effectively suffocating. "You're welcome to whatever personal effects are yours," Garrett said at the end, when the lawyer had finished his portion. "Clothes, that sort of thing." He paused. "And I've arranged to give you $40 against the value of your work here over the years. I think that's fair." He pushed the bills across the table toward her. Nessa looked at them. $40, and a word like fair used by a man who had not visited his own mother in 6 years. She did not argue. She had her grandmother's hammer in her hand. She had picked it up without thinking. When she came in from the shop that morning, the way you pick up a familiar weight, and she looked at Garrett Holt across the table, and she thought very carefully about what to say. "All right," she said. She took the $40. She went to her room, and she packed what she could carry. 2 dresses, a wool shirt, her grandmother's sharpening stone, a tin of beeswax she used for the bellows leather, and the hammer. She wrapped the hammerhead in a piece of oilcloth and put it at the bottom of her bag where it would not knock against anything. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair by the window and listened to the frost settle into the yard and thought about what went next. She had $40, a trade, and a grandmother's worth of stubbornness. She had been cast out of the only home she had known with October, half over and winter coming in hard from the north. She was, to put it plainly, in serious trouble. But she was also a blacksmith, and a blacksmith goes where the iron is. She left before Garrett was awake, pulling the door shut quietly behind her, and walked to the road in the cold gray of early morning without looking back at the house. The days that followed were a slow and humbling education in her own limits. She walked north and east along the river road, her bag over one shoulder and $40 folded into the inside band of her boot, because her grandmother had once told her that was the safest place a woman could keep money she could not afford to lose. She passed through 2 small towns in the first 2 days, asking at both whether there was work for a smith. The first town had a smith already, an older man who looked at her with more skepticism than malice, and told her he didn't need an apprentice. The second had no smith, but also no forge and no prospect of either. By the 3rd day, she had spent $6 on food and a single night in a boarding house, and the cold had settled into her boots and was working its way up through her feet. On the afternoon of the 4th day, she came over a ridge and looked down into a shallow river valley she did not know, and saw, at the edge of a stand of bare birch and spruce, the ruins of what had once been a small mill operation. There were 3 structures: a collapsed mill building with its wheels still standing in the frozen creek, a storage barn with its roof caved inward on one side, and a low, squat building of fieldstone set back from the water, its chimney intact, its walls whole, its windows dark. The stone building was not ruins. It was simply abandoned. She stood on the ridge for a long time looking down. Thomas had told her once. Thomas Chouinard, a river driver who had come through Harrow's Landing the previous summer and sat talking on the shop steps for 2 evenings while she worked. That there were old mill properties all through the Ottawa Valley tributaries, abandoned when the big companies consolidated their operations south. He had said it the way people say things they know as local fact, casually, without meaning to give anyone an idea. But Nessa had listened carefully, and she remembered it now. She went down. The stone building had been a forge. She knew it the moment she pushed the heavy door open, and the dark interior breathed out at her. Cold air, with the faint mineral ghost of old coal smoke, the smell of scale and iron and time. A long stone hearth ran the length of the far wall. Above it, the flue was still sound. She could see a sliver of gray sky at the top. The anvil was gone, but the iron stand that had held it was still bolted to the hearthstone floor. Along one wall, a timber shelf still held a scattering of rusted tools, a pair of tongs with a bent jaw, a drift punch, a handful of cut nails, and pushed to the back, a set of bottom swages in sizes that made her catch her breath. Someone had left in a hurry, or had simply walked away and assumed no one would ever come back. She stood in the center of the cold room and turned slowly, her eye cataloging it the way her grandmother had taught her to look at a piece of work. Not for what it was, but for what it could become. The hearthstone was cracked in 2 places but salvageable. The bellows was rotted through and gone, but the hook and pivot bracket were still in the wall. The floor was packed earth, damp in the northeast corner where the drainage had failed. The roof was sound, fieldstone vaulted, with no timber to rot. The windows were shuttered with wood that had warped and split, but still kept out the worst of the wind. It was derelict, cold and dark and forgotten. But its bones were good. She made a fire that night, from wood she found stacked against the back wall, bone dry, under a collapsed lean-to, as if someone had prepared it for guests who never arrived. And she lay down on her blanket near the hearth and listened to the flames draw up the old chimney, clean and straight. The fire filled the stone room with a warmth that went past the physical. She lay looking at the orange light, moving on the ceiling, and thought, with a startling steadiness, "I can work here." The first order of business was making the space habitable enough to last the winter. She spent 3 days on that alone, moving methodically from problem to problem, the way her grandmother had taught her to approach a complicated repair, one joint at a time, Don't let the whole picture overwhelm you. She plugged the gaps in the shutters with strips of flannel from an old shirt she found folded in a corner. She tamped down the wet patch in the floor with flat stones hauled from the creek, a half-day's work that left her hands numb and her back aching in a way that felt honest. She cleaned the chimney flue with a cedar branch, stripped of its bark, standing on the hearth and pushing the branch up in sections, listening to the dry scrape of debris falling. When she lit the hearth fire after that, it roared. The bellows was the critical problem. Without air, you could not build a fire hot enough to work iron. She had no leather to remake it. New leather cost money, and she was being careful with what she had left. She sat by the fire one evening, turning the problem over in her mind, the way you turn a difficult piece of work in your hand, looking for its logic. And she remembered something her grandmother had told her once, about the very first forge Bertie had ever worked in, a farmstead operation in a barn, where the bellows had been improvised from a barrel, a wooden piston, and a length of dried elk bladder. You work with what the place gives you, Bertie had said. A good smith never needs much, and a great smith can make do with almost nothing. Nessa spent 2 days in the birch and spruce stand, selecting and cutting white birch for the piston frame. She found, in the debris of the collapsed mill building, 3 lengths of pine board she could rip to width with the hand saws she'd been carrying. She made the box of the bellows from these. For the valve and the air bladder, she used the oilcloth she had wrapped the hammer in, doubled over, and stitched with the waxed thread from her grandmother's sewing kit. A small battered tin she had packed almost without thinking. It was not a good bellows. It was a passable one. On the first trial it worked, and she sat back on her heels and exhaled slowly. She could work, but working required iron, and iron required a market, and a market required people to know she was here, and she was. She understood this clearly, completely unknown in this valley. She was a young woman alone in an abandoned forge in a river hollow, and the nearest town was 12 miles of frozen road to the north. She had to make herself visible, and to do that, she had to make something worth seeing. She still had the tools from the shelf. The tongs with the bent jaw she straightened over the course of an afternoon. A slow, careful process of controlled heat and deliberate force, bringing the metal back to true. The bottom swages she cleaned with sand and oil until the rust was gone, and the steel showed gray and sound underneath. The drift punch she examined and found perfect. From the cut nails and a length of strap iron she found in the rubble, she forged, over 3 days of careful work with her improvised bellows, and a round river stone she was using in place of an anvil, an humbling and maddening limitation, a set of 6 hooks and 4 hinges. Rough but solid, the joints tight, the metal well-tempered. She packed these in a cloth and walked the 12 miles to the town. The town was called Stony Reach, and it was the kind of place that knew everyone and trusted no one new on principle. She could feel the assessment happening as she walked down the main street. The slight pause before a nod from a man coming out of the feed merchant, the careful blankness on the face of the woman sweeping the steps of the dry goods store. She had grown up in a small town. She knew what it meant, and she did not take it personally. She went to the hardware merchant first. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s named Aldous Prentice, though the sign above the door said Prentice and Sons, and he looked at her hinges and hooks with the particular expression of a man who handles ironwork daily and knows immediately what he is looking at. "Who made these?" he asked. "I did." She told him about the old forge in the river hollow, that she was setting up there, that she was looking for a market for smith's work and for scrap iron in trade. He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the hinges again. "Price," he said. She named a price. He countered. They settled in the middle, and he bought all 6 hooks and all 4 hinges on the spot. He also told her, in the tone of a man dispensing grudging information, that there was a farm operation 8 miles east that had been waiting 3 months for someone to repair a broken wagon iron and a set of worn-down plow tips. "Our smith moved south in September," he said. "We've been making do." "I can do that work," she said. "I don't doubt it," he said, and she could tell he meant it, which surprised her. She came back from Stony Reach with $11, a commission for the farm work, and a small keg of scrap iron that Prentice had sold her at cost. She walked the 12 miles back in the late afternoon dark, with the keg on her shoulder and the cold working at her ears, and she felt, for the first time since she had left Harrow's Landing, something other than dread. She felt the specific satisfaction of a thing begun. The farm was owned by a family named Douve, or rather, it had been for 3 generations. But the man who worked it now was a widower named Martin Douve, in his 50s, taciturn and deliberate, who met her at the gate of his property with an expression that said he had learned not to expect much and was prepared to be unsurprised. He showed her the wagon iron, a cracked kingpin and a buckled reach plate, and the 3 plow tips worn down past usefulness. He showed her these things without commentary, in the manner of a man who had explained problems to people who then failed to solve them. She looked at everything carefully. She asked 2 questions. She told him she could have the wagon iron ready in 2 days, and the plow tips in 4, and that she would need him to send a horse and sledge to bring the materials to the forge and back. He sent his son the next morning with the pieces and a sledge loaded with enough firewood to fill the lean-to twice over. She worked. The forge rang in the cold river hollow from dawn until the light failed. The kingpin was a clean break, workable. The reach plate required more patience. It had buckled under a load, and the metal had been stressed unevenly, and she had to draw it out carefully, feeling for the soft places, working around them the way you work around a flaw in a piece of timber. The plow tips she drew to a new profile, a slightly longer bevel than the originals, which she had learned from her grandmother, made them hold their edge better in rocky soil. She finished the plow tips in 3 days instead of 4, and sent word back with Martin Douve's son when he came to collect. Martin Douve paid her without haggling. He stood in the doorway of the forge for a moment before he turned to go, looking around the space she had made from the ruin of it. The shelves were clean. The hearth was raked. The tools were hung in order on the wall. "You're staying then," he said. "I am," she said. He nodded, once. It was not warmth. It was not welcome. It was something more useful than either. It was acknowledgement. Word travels differently in the country than in a town. In a town, it runs along the streets, through the shops, in straight lines. In the country, it follows the roads between farms, the tracks between neighbors, the paths that connect one property's back 40 to the next. It is slower, but it goes deeper. Within 3 weeks, Nessa had 3 more commissions from farms in the valley and 1 from a logging operation 10 miles north. She had repaired 2 sets of harness rings, rehooped a set of barrels for a cooper who had run out of band iron at the wrong time, and made a set of custom sleigh bells for a family who wanted them for a daughter's wedding at Christmas. She was careful with the money. She paid for what she needed, put the rest aside, and resisted the urge to acquire things she did not yet truly need. She bought a real anvil, a sound second-hand one that Prentice located through a contact in Pembroke, and the day it arrived on the sledge, she stood looking at it for a full minute before she set it on the stand. It was the thing that changed the feel of the space from improvised to real. She still thought of Harrow's Landing, and of Garrett Holt, and of the $40 and the lawyer's papers. But she thought of them the way you think of weather that has already passed, aware of it, not consumed by it. And then, on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of December, something shifted. Martin Douve came to the forge in the late afternoon, which was unusual. He was not a man who made social visits. He came alone, without his son, and he sat on the bench near the door rather than standing, which was also unusual. Nessa noticed these things. Her grandmother had taught her to notice things. "There's something you should know," he said. He told her about a man named Garrison Crow. Garrison Crow was the largest landowner in the valley, a timber merchant who had expanded his holdings steadily over the previous decade through a combination of strategic lending and selective foreclosure. He was not a local man. He had come up from Montreal 15 years earlier, but he had made himself essential in the way that a burr makes itself part of a coat. He held paper on 4 of the valley's farms, including Martin Douve's. He also, as Martin said with a careful flatness, owned the property on which the old mill site sat, which meant he owned the stone forge building, which meant he owned the ground Nessa had been sleeping on for 6 weeks. She sat very still when Martin told her this. The fire in the hearth popped once and settled. "He knows you're here," Martin said. "He asked me about you last week. He'll come around to the forge himself, I expect. He does that, comes to see things with his own eyes before he makes his decisions." "What kind of decisions?" she asked. "He'll want something from you," Martin said carefully. "He always wants something. The question is what?" Martin Douve did not dislike her. She had understood that for some time despite his manner. He had come here today at some cost to himself. In time, in the risk of Crow's attention falling on him for having warned her. She understood that too. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and went home. That night she did not sleep well. She lay on her cot listening to the wind come off the river and thought about her situation with the same methodical attention she brought to a difficult piece of work. She had built something here. Not much. A livelihood in its earliest stages, a reputation just beginning to take root, a space that had been derelict and was now, by her hands alone, a working forge. She had built it out of nothing, with $40 and a set of tools and her grandmother's knowledge in her bones. And now there was a man who held paper on the ground she had built it on. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about Bertie's hands and Bertie's voice, and the way Bertie had once described a man who had tried to cheat her on the price of a repair. He came to me because I was the only one who could do the work. He thought that was my weakness. He was wrong about which of us needed the other one more. Garrison Crow came to the forge on a Thursday morning, with snow coming down in fine, dry grains that hissed against the stone walls. He was a tall man, perhaps 60, with the careful grooming of someone who understood that appearance was a form of argument. He wore a good coat and good boots, and he came alone, which Nessa had not expected. He looked around the forge with the expression of a man taking inventory. "You've done a great deal with the place," he said. "It needed doing," she said. She was at the anvil, in the middle of a repair, and she did not stop working. She had thought carefully about whether to stop, and decided not to. He watched her for a moment. Then he said, "I own this property." "I know," she said. "I found out last week." This seemed to interest him. He had not expected her to know. "Then you know I could put you out." "You could," she said. "You'd have a vacant ruin again within a season." She set the piece she was working on back in the coals. "Or you could work out an arrangement." She turned and looked at him directly. She had thought about this too. She had thought about it for 3 days, and she knew what she was offering and what she was not. "I want a formal lease," she said. "Fair rent, paid monthly. In exchange, you have a working forge on this property that services the whole valley, which increases the usefulness and the value of the land to you. The operations you run in this valley, timber, farm debt, they all require ironwork. Right now that work is going 12 miles to Stony Reach and back, and it's slow and expensive for every farm here. You could fix that. I could fix that." Garrison Crow was quiet for a moment. He looked at the anvil stand, the bellows, the tools hung clean on the wall. He looked at the hearthstone, and the straight draw of the chimney, and the work she had been doing when he arrived. The careful, competent work of someone who knew what they were doing. "You're very direct," he said. "You came here to assess something," she said. "I'm making it easy for you." He was quiet again. Outside, the fine snow hissed against the stone. "I'll want a reference," he said at last. "Someone in the valley. Ask Martin Douve," she said. "Or Aldous Prentice in Stony Reach." He left without agreeing, but he also left without refusing, and she had been in enough negotiations, watching her grandmother across enough difficult conversations, to know that a man who walks away without a no is a man who is considering a yes. He came back 2 days later with a document. The lease was fair. She had expected it not to be, and had prepared her counter-argument, but it was genuinely fair. A monthly sum that was firm but not punishing, a 3-year term with an option to renew, and a clause that recognized the improvements to the property as belonging to the tenant during the term of the lease. She read it twice, slowly, and signed it. What she had not expected, what she could not have predicted and would only understand later, was the conversation that followed the signing. Garrison Crow sat on the bench near the door, with his coat still on, and told her, in the offhand manner of a man mentioning something that he had been carrying for some time and wanted to set down, that the old mill property had come to him under unusual circumstances, that it had been sold to him 14 years earlier, under duress, by a family named Perrin who had lost their operation to a fire that, he paused here, and the pause had a texture to it, had not been entirely accidental. He said this carefully, in the way that a man says something he cannot unsay. He was looking at the floor when he said it. "Why are you telling me this?" Nessa asked. "Because you're going to be here a while," he said. "And because the Perrin's daughter married into the Douve family." He looked up. Martin Douve's wife. She died 4 years ago. But her family's claim on this property, if someone were to raise it, would complicate things considerably. She understood then what he was telling her, and more importantly, what he was not telling her. He was not confessing. He was not asking for absolution. He was telling her because she had built something here, and because the thing she had built made her, in some sense, a witness. A permanent presence on a property with a contested history. He was managing her, she understood. But he was also, in some oblique way, unburdening himself. "I'm a blacksmith," she said. "Not a lawyer, and not a judge." "No," he said, "but you know what I told you now." He left. She stood in the forge for a long time after he left, the fire working steadily in the hearth, her grandmother's hammer in her hand. She was thinking about foundations, about what things were built on, and what happened when the foundation was wrong, and whether the thing built on top of it could survive the reckoning, or whether the reckoning had to come first. She thought about Martin Duve, who worked a farm his wife's family had lost through a fire that was not an accident, who held debt to Garrison Crow, who had come to warn her, at some risk to himself, when Crow had begun asking questions. She put the hammer down on the anvil and went to find him. Martin Duve listened to what she told him standing in his own doorway, with the snow coming down around them both, and his face went through several expressions, and then settled into something very still. "My wife knew," he said finally. "She never had proof," Crow told me, "not as a confession, but close enough." Martin was quiet for a long time. The snow fell. A horse moved in the barn behind him. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "What can be done?" he said. "There may be something," she said. "If there are records, there were records." This was what she had not told Martin yet. This was what she had been turning over since Crow's visit. Because Garrison Crow was, at his core, a meticulous man. The kind of man who kept documentation for everything, because documentation was power, and because he had built his holdings on paper as much as on land. And a man who keeps documentation of everything, keeps documentation of the things he should not have done, as well as the things he should have. That was the nature of a certain kind of careful, methodical dishonesty. It left evidence. She knew where his office was, a building in Stony Reach that Prentice had pointed out when she walked by. She knew that Crow came to Stony Reach on Fridays, and that on Fridays he had dinner with the Reeve, and that during that dinner, the office was empty. She did not break in. She did not have to, because on the Thursday before she went to Martin, she had returned to Stony Reach on the pretext of collecting a supply order, and she had spent 45 minutes in conversation with Crow's clerk, a young man named James, 20 years old, who was from the Ottawa Valley and whose grandfather, she had established through careful conversation, had been one of the men Garrett Perrin employed at the mill before the fire. She simply told James what she knew. She had not planned this moment to be dramatic. She did not produce the information like a weapon. She mentioned it quietly, in the middle of a conversation about something else, watching his face. What she saw there was not surprise. It was recognition. He had heard something from his grandfather or from his grandfather's people. He had not had the piece that made it coherent. She had given him that piece. James came to the forge on a Sunday, riding through the snow alone, and he brought with him a folded document he had copied in his own hand, from a file that he said had been misfiled in a cabinet under a different property name. The document was an insurance assessment from 14 years earlier, written by an inspector who had noted in careful neutral language that the pattern of burn damage at the Perrin mill was inconsistent with an accidental fire of natural origin, and that this assessment had been forwarded to the property buyer as a condition of the sale adjustment. The property buyer was Garrison Crow. He had known. He had bought the property at a reduced price because of a fire he had known was not an accident, and he had paid a reduced price accordingly. And he had folded that knowledge into his files and built 14 years of profitable operation on top of it. Nessa sat at the workbench with the document in her hands and felt the particular cold clarity that comes when the shape of a thing finally becomes fully visible. She thought about what her grandmother would do. Bertie Holt had never been a vindictive woman. She had not taught Nessa to seek revenge. What she had taught her was that a shoddy repair was not a repair at all, that if you did not fix the thing properly, you had not fixed it, and you had also wasted the materials and the time. When something was wrong, you made it right. Not for satisfaction, not for vengeance, but because that was what right meant. The confrontation, if you could call it that, happened at the forge on a Wednesday morning in January with a foot of snow on the ground and the river locked solid under its gray ice. Nessa had sent word to Crow through Prentice. She had asked him to come. She had told him why. He came alone again. She had expected that. A man who managed his reputation as carefully as Garrison Crow did not bring witnesses to conversations he intended to control. She showed him the document. She told him about James. She said nothing more than was necessary. The fire in the hearth was the only sound for a long moment. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want Martin Duve's debt cancelled," she said, "all of it. And I want a deed of transfer, a gift deed, no consideration, for the easternmost 10 acres of the Perrin parcel, transferred to Martin Duve or his estate. His wife's family worked that land. It ought to be in his hands." Crow looked at her steadily. "And the document goes to a solicitor in Ottawa," she said. "In an envelope. It opens if something happens to me, or to Martin, or to anyone connected with this. Otherwise it sits." She paused. "I'm not asking you to ruin yourself," she said. I'm asking you to make one piece of this right. The rest is between you and your own thinking." He left without a word. She was not certain he would do it. He did it. The debt transfer came through in February, through Prentice's office, documented and legal. The deed for the 10 acres followed in March. Martin Duve sat at her workbench when she told him, and put his large weathered hands flat on the table and looked at them for a long time. "How did you manage this?" he asked. "I found the right leverage," she said, "and I asked for the right thing." Spring came slowly into the river hollow, the ice going out in the creek in chunks and chunks, the birch coming green at the tips before the snow was fully gone. The forge was warm and busy. Nessa had 3 commissions ahead, and a new commission for a set of architectural ironwork, decorative hinges and door plates, for a house being built in Stony Reach by a family who had seen her work and wanted something particular. It was the most demanding work she had taken on yet, and she was glad of it. She was not the outcast who had arrived with $40 and a borrowed piece of ground anymore. She was Nessa of the Hollow Forge, not because anyone called her that, but because that was what she had become, in the quiet way that a thing becomes what it is through the work of many days. The valley knew her now, not in all its detail, not the full shape of what had happened with Crow and the Perrin land and the fire, but they knew she was the woman who had taken a ruin and made something of it, who knew her trade, and who, as Martin Duve had said to Prentice, who had said it elsewhere, had settled a thing in this valley that had needed settling for a long time. On the first warm morning of April, she stood outside the forge door with her coffee, watching the creek run high and fast with meltwater, the birch making a thin green haze against the pale sky. In her left hand, without thinking about it, she held her grandmother's hammer. The ash handle had begun just barely to take the shape of her own grip. Not Bertie's groove, her own. She thought about the $40, about the lawyer's papers on the kitchen table in Harrow's Landing, about a man who had used the word fair and meant something else by it entirely. She thought about what she had done with that $40 and that word, and what it had grown into, here in a river hollow in the Ottawa Valley, through 6 months of cold mornings and careful work and the knowledge her grandmother had put in her hands. Garrett Holt had thought he was sending her away with nothing. He hadn't understood what he was giving her. The $40 and the closed door had sent her to the one place where everything she knew how to do was exactly what was needed. In a valley that had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone with the skill to see what was broken and the patience to make it right. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What overlooked door in your own life has been quietly waiting for you to walk through it?